Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. I'm here with Will. Will, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, man. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Well, thank you, Robin. My name is William Law, and I have been involved in the research of the JFK assassination for probably about 35 years at this point.
And where do you particularly focus when it comes to JFK research?
My particular interest is in the JFK autopsy. I always thought that if you could find people that were involved in Kennedy's autopsy, you could understand, or whether they could understand, whether there was conspiracy in the assassination because they had their hands on President Kennedy's body. And I thought surely trained medical personnel could give me the answers that I needed. Now, I'm not the first one to do this. There have been other people that have come before me. David Lifton wrote a book, Best Evidence, which is what started me off way back in the 80s. I was in a bookstore and I was going through some books, and I happened to stumble upon Best Evidence. And I opened this book up, and in the middle of this book were pictures I had never seen before. It was autopsy pictures of President Kennedy, and they were pretty gruesome. And I looked at them and I thought, well, something doesn't appear quite right. I hadn't studied anything about anatomy. I hadn't studied really anything on the Kennedy assassination. I bought that, I grew up with the story that Lee Harvey Oswald shot John F. Kennedy while he was traveling in a car in downtown Dallas. I was not really aware of the controversy till I picked that book up. Now, the premise of the book is that at some point between Dallas, Texas, where the assassination took place, and Bethesda, Maryland, where his body was taken for autopsy, somewhere in between that route or somewhere on the hospital grounds, the body had been gotten to before the official autopsy, a pre-autopsy autopsy, for lack of a better word. I don't know that I would call it a pre-autopsy autopsy. Whether you want to call it a pre-autopsy before the official autopsy, or you want to call it a probing of the body, same thing. I read this thing and I thought, this is preposterous. This cannot be true. But it lit something in me that I could not put out. I read the book and I read it over, and I started reading other books. I read everything that I could get my hands on the Kennedy assassination. It got to the point where after reading and reading, I started calling witnesses in Dealey Plaza. Now, keep in mind, this is in the 90s or late 80s and then into the 90s, where I was calling people. And at this point, I thought, well, I think I was like 39 years old at the point. And I thought, you know what? I had stumbled across something that had an announcement for a conference on the JFK assassination. And I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to go to this thing. I'm going to go to Texas. I'm going to go to this thing. I'm going to talk to those people that are like-minded like I am. I'm going to get this thing out of my system. I'm going to listen to everybody and what they have to say. I'm going to go home and I'm going to be a normal person. I'm not going to think about this anymore. I'm not going to read about this anymore. I'm just going to go home and get on with my life, because it had just consumed me. I couldn't get it out of my head. I read about it every day. I thought about it every day. It was always in the back of my head. So I did go to Dallas. I went to the conference. I got to speak to Bill Newman, who was the closest person to President Kennedy at the time that he was shot in the head, him and his wife. They had me out to their house in Mesquite, Texas, with a couple of friends of mine that I happened to make while I was there. And it just, instead of having the fire go down, meeting Bill Newman and Gail Newman and his wife, and then sitting through the conference, I was talking to George Michael Ivica, who was co-chair of the conference. I think it was at lunch or dinner. I can't remember what. And I said, you know, if you really want to get to the bottom of this thing, you have to study the medical evidence, because that's where the answers are. It's in the medical evidence. And he looked at me and said, well, would you like to put a panel on for next year? First, he said, well, would you like to go up on stage and talk about it? And I thought, no, I don't want to do that. He said, well, would you like to put a panel together for the next year? And I said, well, yeah, I could probably do that. So I go home, and far from I'm going to leave this thing alone, I think it was like 3 months later, I found myself sitting in Jerrol Custer's living room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with a camera on him, asking him about his experiences in the autopsy room. Jerrol Custer was the man who took President Kennedy's x-rays. And I spent 2 or 3 days with him. I stayed with the researcher Vince Palomar, who wrote a book called Survivor's Guilt, and it's been very well received.
He's been on here.
And so we just sat and tried to pry as much out of him as we could. And that just was such an experience that, you know, and that was my very first real interview. I'd interviewed Bill Newman, and he allowed me to put a camera on him. But when I did it with Custer, you know, the thing is, I didn't know his whole story. The only thing I'd seen of Jerrol Custer at that point was David Lifton's Best Evidence interview. I hadn't seen anything else about him. And so it did teach me a lesson to know the story as well as I could know it before I interviewed the person that I was going to interview, because there were some things that I needed to go back and talk to Jerrol about. Unfortunately, I never got the chance, because by the time I'd set up a new interview and he'd agreed to it, he passed away in 2000.
I haven't had the chance to speak to David Lifton yet. I'd like to, but I've heard a lot of people mention a lot of this stuff, and there's some things I just can't get with. Like, I don't think they bashed Kennedy's head like open to get bullet fragments out. I don't know if that's in his book or not, but I just can't get there. But I can definitely tell, like, there's issues with the autopsy in general, and whether you want to say it's because it was special circumstances because it was the president, but a lot of things that, if you agree with that there's special circumstances, that it's because it's the president, but they also didn't fly over people that were expertly qualified to be able to do the autopsy. They had 2 people who haven't even done an autopsy walk in there and start putting in a tracheotomy into his throat instead of looking at the giant hole in the back of his head. I mean, that's one of the issues as well too with the autopsy is when I see these photos online, someone posts them up in the forum or something, you see a whole back explosion of Kennedy's head. I'm pretty sure this was in Oliver Stone's new film as well, too, where there was just a whole back blown out. And I start going, okay, so that agrees with the witnesses that were there that said they saw a back explosion. And that also agrees with Clint Hill, who says he saw a hole in the back of Kennedy's head. But then everyone says, no, those are not real autopsy photos, where I go, all right, someone's got to walk me through the medical evidence. I had Gary on here try and explain it. It's so much information you get lost, you know. I mean, I can look at things of like Secret Service members pulling out their guns and saying they're taking Kennedy's body. People label that as conspiracy. Well, I go, I mean, was Jackie Kennedy ordering that she wanted to get her husband home? I have no clue at the time. So I'm trying to balance all of this in my head and realize what's real and what's conspiracy, then what's the super movie stuff, where it's like I've never heard of that before. When I had David Mancic on here, who explained a lot about the x-rays, and he talked about that the x-rays that they ended up the ones in the archives didn't match, I guess, the original x-rays or something like that. And it's just like, oh my God, like, you're in this area where that was my first interest into the assassination, was all the skull fragment, all this stuff. And then it's like, I ended up going into witness testimonies and where I'm at now, just scrolling through the archives and looking at all the agents and individual actors. And I have a fascination with Jack Ruby. But could you walk me through the medical evidence? Like after he's shot in that motorcade, they take him to Parkland, and then where's the funkiness start?
Well, let's go back to Dallas. He's in the motorcade. Depending on who you talk to, at least 3 shots rang out. He is rushed to Parkland Hospital. He's put into trauma room 1. They cut off his clothing and his back brace. Ringer's lactate is ordered, which is nothing more than salt water. They do a cut down on one of his ankles and I think one of his arms to put the Ringer's lactate in. They look at the wound. Now, depending on who you talk to, which doctor's testimony you read, some say that the wound was about that big around, a large orange or a large egg-sized hole in the back of his head. Lost a lot of blood. They tried to revive him. They say they put a couple of cuts to put things in his what do they call them? To shock his heart back in. They did chest
Defibrillators?
massage. Yeah, they did chest massage on him. They basically knew he was gone from the size of the wound. They did. Dr. Malcolm Perry put a right over a bullet wound, what he said was a bullet wound right here, about the knot of the tie, about the end of your little finger. It was round and ragged. He just did a little slice over that so that they could put a tracheotomy tube in to help him breathe. They did what they could to save his life. One of the doctors said that his cerebellum, which is it's a different color and it's a different texture of your brain and sits directly low on the back in your skull. One doctor said it was literally swinging in the breeze. Depending on what testimonies you read, the doctors at first said in a press conference after President Kennedy had died, about an hour after all that was done, they said the bullet was fired at him, and somebody asked, well, which direction did it appear to be coming at him? And he said, well, it appeared to be coming at him, the bullet, meaning probably the throat wound here. President Kennedy died around 1:00. The nurses, after everybody cleared out, dabbed him off a little bit. A 400-pound Britannia casket was brought in. They wrapped him in sheets, placed him in a casket with some plastic lining on it to keep the satin interior from being soaked with blood, closed it up. There was a scuffle with some of the Secret Service agents. They wanted to take Kennedy's body out. The Dr. Earl Rose said, I'm the one that has to do the autopsy. It has to be done here in Dallas. And they said, you're either going to get out of our way or we're going to roll over you. There was a little talk, and then Dr. Rose let them go out. They took the body, placed it in an ambulance from the funeral home. That went to Love Field. It was placed aboard the plane. They had to take some seats out to make accommodations for the casket. The casket was loaded aboard. And then the plane took off, and then it went to Andrews Air Force Base, and from there was driven to Bethesda Naval Hospital, about a 45-minute drive. And then of course, so it all gets weird. I mean, it's weird from the time that he's shot in Dealey Plaza to the time he reaches Parkland Hospital. Let me go back and explain that the wounds on President Kennedy's body, the hole in the back of the head here was about that size. We have a wound in the throat at the knot of the tie, about the end of your little finger. you have when it gets to Bethesda and they put him on the table, the wound has now become the back, the side, part of the head up here.
Okay, so that's where David Lifton gets that they might have bashed in Kennedy's. I didn't know that. I thought that was just completely fabricated.
Well, you can see it in the autopsy photographs. His if you've seen them all, the ones that we have in the public domain, his scalp at one point is on a headrest and it's completely laid open. That was not seen in Dallas. What was seen in Dallas was a small, a little more off to the side, egg-sized or large orange shaped wound in the back of his head. Now, some people say that the scalp was blown out, and that they didn't see it because the scalp covered the wound back here, and so they didn't really see that in Dallas because the hair was all matted and glued down, and Kennedy had a lot of hair. I suppose that's possible. I wasn't in the room. All I can tell you is that the wounds appear different when the body reaches Bethesda. Now, here's where it gets weirder. We have 3 different entries for a casket. You have, but when the plane touches down and they drive the body to Bethesda Naval Hospital, they go around and they at 8. The official entry is at 8:00, where the body comes in with the honor guard. Honor guard is from all military branches. They all have their uniforms on. Something that you would notice. Okay, that happens at 8:00. But Dennis David, who was a corpsman, says that he gave orders to unload a cheap metal shipping casket at the back of the Bethesda morgue at about 6:40, 6:45, and that these men took this casket in. They took the metal shipping casket into the morgue and they set it on the floor and they left. Okay, so that's the first entry. The FBI says that they took it in. 2 FBI agents, Sibert and O'Neill, and Kellerman and Greer, who were the passenger and driver of the limousine in Dealey Plaza, said that the FBI agents said they took it in about 7:17. Now, the difference here is Dennis David says he had his men take in a metal shipping casket. The FBI says they took in a display casket. The honor guard says they brought in a display casket. Dennis David, Paul O'Connor, and Jim Jenkins, who helped the doctors with the autopsy, said that President Kennedy's body came in inside the metal shipping casket, inside of a body bag, totally nude when you unzip the body bag, except for the fact that he had sheets and towels wrapped around his head. That's where it gets complicated, and that's where it gets weird.
I remember Gary mentioning the 645 casket that got dropped off before the official one. And my thought just starts going, I mean, if you're going to have somebody come across your transportation of Kennedy's body, you necessarily would probably have a separate time you got the real body there, then you would have a display one, which is this aspect of you have a dressed up casket. It could be empty, but you have a bunch of guards carrying it in a nice proper manner. But the real stuff probably was given there earlier, just maybe when nobody was looking outside, anybody possibly could be around. I mean, 6:45, I don't know who's going to be up that early walking around outside of a funeral home or at a hospital or something like that. But
Well,
I mean,
this was at 9. This was at 9.
okay.
This was not in the morning. This was in the evening. Now remember, President Kennedy's body was killed around 12:30 uh, and he was pronounced dead around 1 o'clock. And then he was flown to Bethesda or Andrews Air Force Base, and then driven to Bethesda. So this is in the evening time now. There were lots of people on the grounds because once people heard that President Kennedy was on his way, I get from what I was told on the Bethesda grounds, and I've been to Bethesda since I've done all this stuff, that Dennis David put to me, he said, you couldn't see any ground. He said there were so many people on that turf there. There were people everywhere. They did have a security staff surrounding the building, to keep people out away from the building. But the grounds were covered at that point.
Well, when it comes to the back hole, the original thing before he ended up having like his scalp and everything in that photo, when it comes to the original hole in the back of the head that was there, that is exactly when all the witnesses they drew what they thought like Kennedy's head. They had like a little drawing of it, and they all drew the same exact shape in the back of the skull, and that's occipital bone, if I'm not mistaken. And that leads into what the Harper fragment was, I think, found by, I forgot his first name, but it was the Harper guy that found the fragment. Yeah.
Billy Harper. Yeah.
So when it comes to now, I'm starting to look at David Lifton's theory about bashing the head open a little bit. When it comes into the coffin scenario, though, when his head's wrapped, I mean, there's a speculation and there's ideas that people say that, his brain, for instance, it was above average for a brain, and not just like slightly above average, but something a little bit more like he would be one of the smartest men alive if he had a brain like that.
I believe it was 1,500 grams, and I think the average brain is around 1,400 grams. Now, keep in mind that when the doctors in Parkland Hospital saw President Kennedy, they said that he had a brain in his head, although there was some of it gone. The FBI agents, Sibert and O'Neill, had a lot of it on the back of their jackets. It was in no way an intact brain. But they have pictures in the archives that is purportedly of President Kennedy's brain, but it doesn't have nearly the damage that you would expect President Kennedy's brain to have, given what happened to him.
Well, it doesn't even match the Zapruder film. Whenever someone says you think there's a conspiracy involved in JFK, I was like, if you look at the archived photos of the brain and then you look at the Zapruder film, whether you think it's fake or not, if you just know Kennedy got shot in the head, and you see the motorcade pictures afterward, it looks like a scene from Carrie, a bloodbath all over the place. Even Jackie Kennedy picking out some out of her teeth. You just get into this aspect where it's like, obviously it's not going to be fully intact like that. There's going to be either the whole right side gone of it, or there's going to be a giant piece missing out of the back of it. But people will say that's conspiracy. It's like, no shit, it's a government conspiracy.
Frank O'Neill, who was one of the FBI agents that was ordered to go with Kennedy's body, stay with the body, and take whatever evidence was found back to the FBI laboratory in Washington. When Jeremy Gunn asked him, he gave the FBI agent pictures, and he said, "Is this a picture of what you remember President Kennedy's brain looking like?" And he said, "Well, it appears to be too much." Gunn says, "Well, in what way does it appear to be different?" And O'Neill says, "Well, it appears to be too much." He says, "This doesn't appear to be the brain I saw." He said, "If you're saying that this is a picture of President Kennedy's brain, then okay, it is." But he said, "I can't swear on a stack of Bibles that that's what I remember." Let me take you back to when I started my research. Maybe we can get a better grasp on this. I was so intrigued that I decided to start seeing if I could contact these same people that Mr. Lifton had contacted, because I wanted to test it. It had me so bad that I thought, well, maybe if I can talk to them, I can I can tell whether the story had been slanted a certain way. So I did start calling people. I think the first person I called was Paul O'Connor, and I talked to him, and he told me about the metal shipping casket, and he told me basically the same story that he told Lifton, that they got the metal shipping casket in, placed it on the floor, they took the body out of the casket. They said we unzipped the body bag quickly, put the body on the table. Then the doctors came in, they unwrapped the head. He said a large gasp went up in the room because the wound was so massive. He said literally there was a big hole in his head. He said there was no brain in the cranium. He said there might have been half a handful of macerated brain. Now this is different from Dallas. Remember, he had a brain in his head in Dallas. It was damaged, and the cerebellum was swinging in the breeze, according to one doctor. But by the time it reaches Bethesda Naval Hospital and it's on the table, it is now basically a body with no brain in the cranium. And then he proceeded to tell me, he said it was my job that to do the skull cap. Now, what they do in an autopsy is I hope this isn't too graphic for your audience. They take the head and they take a bone chisel and they chisel around the top of the head, and they put a little notch in the bone so that you can put the bone back in the right spot. And then they cut that bone off. Then they have the thick lining that encases the brain. You cut that open, and then the brain is exposed. And then you take a long pair of shears and you take it and you go down to the spinal column and you clip that. And then the brain falls back into your hand and you lift it out. And at that point, they take it and they put it at Bethesda. They take it and they put it in what's called a brain bucket, which is no more than a steel bucket with a gauze sling in it that you put the brain into, that has formalin in it, which is a preserving solution. And that sits in there and hardens the brain so that it can be later cut and examined. According to Paul, there was no brain to be removed. Now, conversely, Jim Jenkins, his partner, said, I was handed a brain that night. He said it was given to him by Boswell, Dr. Boswell, who was with Dr. Humes. He said, I was given the brain. Dr. Boswell and I took it over to the brain bucket. Dr. Boswell handed it to me. I put it in the sling, and it stayed there. So he said the brain that he had was a brain that he thought was considerably smaller, didn't have as much damage to it as you would expect from the damage to the skull. Okay. Now, I went and I brought Paul O'Connor here to Oregon, and he told me the whole story. I had decided at that point to start writing a book about the experiences I was having. I went on to after Custer, I interviewed O'Connor, and then I interviewed Jim Jenkins. Now, in David Lifton's book, Best Evidence, Jim comes along. He seems, by Lifton's description, to be a little traumatized, more than a little traumatized by the event, and so I didn't know what to expect. So when I called Jim, he was one of the people that I most wanted to talk to, because I hadn't heard a lot from him. I hadn't read much about him other than Best Evidence, and I think I had read at that point some of Harrison Livingstone's material, who came along after Lifton and did indeed interview Jim. When I first talked to him, he was reticent to talk to me. I'm surprised he stayed on the phone as long as he did. I have notes where I'd written down Warren Commission was nothing but show, that sort of thing. And I would call him every once in a while. And at one point, I called him and I said, Jim, I could get a nice price on a ticket if you'd allow me to come see you. He lived in around New Orleans at that point, and I said, he said you could, huh? And so he agreed to let me come see him. Okay, so now I'm really excited because I'm going to get to see Jenkins. He said he's allowed me to come. So I packed up all my stuff as I usually did, and had this big. I had a camera that was brand new, and I got into my hotel room, and it was steaming in New Orleans. It was hotter than hell, and I wasn't used to the heat. It was a long trip, and I almost got on the wrong bus to take me downtown, which would have been absolutely disastrous. And I finally made it to my hotel room. It took me forever. I wasn't used to using the slide guard. It took me forever to get into my hotel room. And when I do an interview, I don't generally sleep well the night before because I'm so tense about the whole thing. And in the back of my head, I kept thinking, he's going to cancel on me. He's going to cancel on me. He's going to cancel on me. So I'm up early the next morning. I hadn't had anything to eat. I'm starving. I still have this thing in the back of my head that he's going to cancel on me. I had some questions. Now, keep in mind, I thought, I'm going to take this guy and I'd never been to New Orleans before. So I'm excited to see Jim, but I'm also excited that I'm in New Orleans. And I'm going to take him to the French Quarter. We'll go to the French Quarter. We'll have a nice lunch. I'll set the camera up. I'll have this time with him, and we'll have a really nice time and a really nice lunch, and it'll be loose. And I can ask him the questions. Finally, I get this call, and he says, William, I'm in the lobby. It's Jim. So all the trepidation I had melted away. I thought, all right, he's here. So I go down to the lobby, and he's standing there, and he's like dressed nicely in a crisp white shirt and a pair of black pants and some black polished shoes, and he's got his hands deep in his pockets, and he's got a shock of white hair and a trim white beard. And I walked up and I said, Jim, and he's looking at his picture on the wall. He turns around and he says, well, hello, William. And he's got a nice southern drawl to his voice, just a touch. And he could have been a high school history teacher. It was like, this is fantastic. So I said, well, I haven't eaten. There's a little restaurant around the corner. Let's go have some breakfast. And he said, well, I'm not really hungry, but I'll have a Coke. So we go into this restaurant and we sit down and we have Coke. Now I'm starving, but I don't want to appear like, I got to have this big breakfast. And so I'm just cool about the whole thing, and I'm having a Coke. And he starts talking to me, and he says, I was no more than 19 to 20 years old. And he said, I found out my country was no better than a third world country. He said, I don't trust people, and I don't trust the government. And this was the start of it. And he starts going into the assassination. And I said, Jim, let's wait, because I wanted it to be fresh and I wanted to get in before the camera. And I said, let's wait. Let's go up to the room and do it up there, because I want it to be natural. I want it to be fresh. And I had said previously, I said, let's go to the French Quarter. He says, well, my wife is going to be back in 45 minutes. So now he said, I've got 45 minutes, right? So now it's like, well, let's go up to the room. And he says, William, and I knew what was coming. I could feel it. Now, I had told him previously that I was working on this book, and I wanted to talk to him and that sort of thing. And he'd said yes. So now he says, my wife is going to be back in 45 minutes. So now the whole afternoon is gone. I'm not going to get to take him to the French Quarter. I'm not going to have a nice lunch. I said, so, okay, let's go up to the room and shoot it. And he looks at me and he says, William, I'd just soon sit here and talk about this without you filming me. So now he looked at me for like what was probably about 10 seconds, but to me, it was an eternity. So my face must have dropped because he looked at me for those 10 seconds. And at the end of it, he said, with a little pit in his voice, he says, all right, William, I'll do it for you. Let's go do it. Great. So I jump up from the table and I take him up to the room and I sit him down. Now, keep in mind, I had written this rough set of questions, but nothing formal. I wanted to keep it nice and loose and just kind of have stuff to remind myself. So I opened up the curtains. It was a brand new camera. I hadn't used it much. I turned it on. I hoped the settings were right. I hoped I had lighting enough for it. He sat down. I turned the camera on. I thought, I didn't know whether he was going to give me, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 20 minutes, and then just leave. So I'm really stressed. And I try when I interview people, even then it was like nice and easy, and we'll ask easy questions. And we'll get all warmed up, and then he'll get comfortable. People will get comfortable with me.
A little bit opposite from what I do. I just kind of spur you right to the moment.
Well, I didn't have time for any of that now because he says my wife is going to be back in 45 minutes. So I picked up the tablet, camera was on. I had these questions. I just started asking the question. Ask the question, get the answer. Ask the question, get the answer. Ask the question, get the answer. Then I managed. I said I wasn't gonna bother him with the autopsy photographs, but I said, I got these autopsy photographs. Would you look at these? And he did. Now, he at one point I'm sitting and it's like sitting across the table from somebody, and he says, talking about Kennedy's brain, he said, the brain appeared to be smaller than I would have thought. And he said there wasn't much damage to it for the damage to the skull. And he said, the arteries coming off the brain, he said, I had to try to put formalin into that, and I had to get needles into the arteries to put the formalin inside of the brain. And he said they were constricted a bit on the ends, and I was having trouble getting the needles in, and I had to have one of the guys come over and try to help me get the needles in. And I said, well, Jim, what does that mean to you? And he looked at me very quiet and he said, what that means to me is I think the brain was removed and then replaced. Now I'm trying to be professional here, like I hear this every week, But when you're sitting, like imagine myself sitting really close to you, just across from a little table, and you say to me, I think that the brain was removed and then replaced. And he's looking at me right in the eyes when he's saying it. That's what he believes. And I'm trying to go, okay. But in my head, I'm like, oh my God, I wanted to fall on the floor, right? So, and at one point he says, Humes made an utterance. He says, what I think he said, okay, was meaning the brain. That damn thing fell out in my hand. Because he's standing close to Humes in case Humes needs anything. That's what he's there for. And he heard Humes say, the damn thing fell out in my hand. So I get all this stuff, and then it's over and we've wrapped. I can't tell you mainly what because we don't have enough time to go into it, but that was the main point. He says, I think the brain was removed and then replaced. And we finish up. And instead of, just giving me 45 minutes, by the time the interview ended, he had given me 2 hours and 5 minutes. We go back down and chatting to the lobby so that, because his wife was supposed to be there. His wife, Jackie, was there, introduced me. And I said, Jim, if you'd like, there's going to be a conference that I'd like to invite you to. He puts his hands up and says, I don't want to go to Dallas. And he's gone. He and his wife are out the door. So that was my first experience face to face with Jim Jenkins, talking about the brain.
So, I mean, the way I'm receiving it right now is it possible that they could have done an autopsy before that autopsy where he grabbed the brain and he realized this wasn't the brain that would match the description. And I start realizing I know people speculate what's in the archives and stuff, but I start going like, I mean, maybe they have the real autopsy, the original one in there. And I think what a lot of people talk about with the brain is that the Parkland Medical Hospital, they also have like students that work there and they have a way of like people do autopsies all the time. There's what is it? Cadaver brain. Because people talked about it looked like it was soaking in formaldehyde for 3 days or something of that sort.
That was things that we found out later, many years later, um, um, from a fellow. Uh, his name escapes me. Forgive me, Mike Chesser, who has gone into the archives and studied uh, photographs of what is purportedly Kennedy's brain, and he believes that that brain that is in that picture was in with a bunch of other brains at one point in formalin solution, because of the way it's shaped and the color of the brain and things like that. I don't think you've read any of my books, but we go into that in At the Cold Shoulder of History. Um, that's a book I wrote with Jim Jenkins. Now, keep in mind that I kept up with Jim Jenkins. I kept up with everybody. I would have phone calls just because I wanted to keep in touch with them. I wanted to see how they were doing. I wanted to ask additional questions long after the book was done. Um, and Jim, 20 years later, said to me one day, William, my wife, Jackie, has said to me that she thinks I should do something for history. Would you be willing to help me with a book? And I said, of course I would. Um, and he came to the 50th anniversary, first one he'd ever been to, conference on John F. Kennedy. So we've remained in touch with each other and close. Um, people say, you shouldn't make these people your friends. They're witnesses. Well, I'm sorry. I'm not a hard-bitten journalist. I never said I was. There were reasons that I wanted to stay close to these guys. You don't expect that these people are going to be part of your life, but they remained part of my life long after the book was written. You can't help but have contact with people and not care about what happens to them. Uh, and Dennis David, when he lost his wife Dorothy, he hadn't even made it back from the hospital, and he called me. Uh, uh, this is years later. Called me. He's still coming back from the hospital, and he said, "William, we lost Mama," um, and he had emotion in his voice. Um, so I got close to these guys. Part of it was because I needed to test their veracity, but they had long since stopped being test subjects for me, if you want to put it that way. Um, and why that happened is I took, I think it was like 1998, I took Paul O'Connor and Dennis David to a conference. And at this, they had a film. I think it was called "The Day John F. Kennedy Died" or something like that. Or some music that they played was "The Day John F. Kennedy Died." And I happened to have Bill Newman and his wife Gail, who I'd stayed in touch with, and Paul O'Connor and Dennis David at my table, and a couple of others. And they turned the lights down. It was real dark, and they played this film with this music. And I'm sitting there watching it, and all of a sudden I start looking around my table. The Newmans are just looking at it, and they're very stoic and not really moving their facial muscles. Paul O'Connor is bent over with a handkerchief over his face, and his shoulders are heaving, listening to this. And Dennis David is just sitting there, and he's looking at it, and tears are streaming down his face. And that's the moment that it hit me that these people are not your test subjects, William. They are people that went through a traumatic event in this nation's history. And every time I had to bring them back into that, every time they saw a film, every time I questioned them about it, I was asking them to walk through the biggest nightmare of their lives. And they did it. You learn a lot when you do things like this. You're asking people to walk you through their nightmare when you take them through and ask them these questions. It's, I can be distanced from it because I wasn't there and I didn't experience it. So whether it's a person that was in Dealey Plaza and saw President Kennedy killed, or whether you're standing over his body helping with an autopsy, that was a big, big thing to most of them. And here I come along and others come along and just ask them questions because we want to know and it's exciting. And to them, it takes every question, every time they look at a documentary, it takes them right back to that moment. And so I became very conscious of that. And I think it made me a better interviewer doing that.
People would bring up the example of the same situation with Ruth Payne. And I thought that for the longest time too, but I've seen so many interviews with her where I go, she likes talking about it, but only if it fits the official story that obviously it was a lone nut that did it. And I go, well, that's not really having your way. I mean, now you have to accept criticism because you're openly accepting interviews, but it doesn't affect her the way it affects people that, notice. Like when you hear someone say to you, I noticed that our government was no different from that. That's the same thing I heard from Marina Oswald, and she was talking about her Russian government. And then you look at the person you interview, and they tell you the same thing before you even get the camera rolling. I mean, that's got to be something where it's not just world shattering. I mean, to me, I thought like a lot of this is scary as hell because it is, but it's also fascinating because like I know so much about the politics that happened today, not necessarily how bad, like how far back it went, but my first introduction was Watergate. And then I'm realizing with William Colby and talking to friends of William Colby on my show. And then I start getting this whole perspective of like, oh, this has just always been here, but has the public ever had the viewpoint of it as well, too? And you start realizing that, yeah, I mean, it's horrible for people who witness this thing, for people that, get badgered probably all the time to interview. I'm just looking for my own personal knowledge. Like, I feel bad even asking Marina Oswald if she'll just talk to me on the phone about it because I know how hard it's got to be living your life. People think a certain thing, you just want it to go away. But from a historical standpoint, I mean, you got to look at that as well too. The experts like yourself that interview these people who are no longer with us, and then I mean, I'm coming at it late in the game, mostly because everybody else is about 50 years or 40 years ahead of me. But you get to see like the impacts it has on people, and I get the emotional connection thing. I really do. There are people I won't have on my show because I know way too much about them and I'm too connected to them to even bring out the interview kind of side of things. Even some of my favorite heroes, I would never ask them to do this. It would just be the worst conversation. I couldn't get over that fame aspect of things. But I think it's when you look at them like not only as like you said a test subject, we look at them as like a friend and you just develop that connection with them. You end up even for yourself, if it's personal knowledge and understanding, they open up more and you get more than what they're used to. I mean, how hard is it for half of these experts or people that were involved, such as not Ruth Payne, but other people like you know, I'm trying to think of an example that I could use. Just people that were involved, either Secret Service, whatever. It's hard for them to just open up to an interview because you don't know what people are thinking. Half the time I'm on the education forum, I'm thinking, is this person a lone nutter or is he a C tier? I have no clue because you don't know what you're walking into. And it's just like you walking into this. You didn't know who I was. You accepted the grace of somebody else that recommended me, and you're here. And then you get to see I'm just a curious kid interested in the subject of the assassination, but that's not most people. Most people have a gain they want to get out of something. They look to try and put you over there. I don't know how many articles I've seen on the forums that are just trash talking articles about people writing blog posts about other people involved in the community. I get that, but when you're entering into this, like how I am now, and you see that, oh, why hasn't this been solved with all the information we have out now and all the evidence that's came out? Oh, it's because we're still kind of fighting over like really, really dumb stuff. And I think the best thing we can do today is, be able to get more people interested into it to hopefully get some information out there. I bet you in those unreleased documents, there's got to be a real autopsy there, man. 3 caskets getting dropped off and people saying the body was in this one and this one. That's weird.
Well, that's an understatement. Yeah. I'm glad that you're interested in it. I'm glad you're as young as you are because, as long as I've been doing this, I'm not going to be around forever. I'm not anywhere near the first generation of researchers to take this up. And so we hopefully uh, you will continue on. It's important the work that you do to get these people on the record, if nothing else, for future generations that can come back and look at this stuff. That's what's important to me. Not I don't go on forums. I don't get myself involved in questions. When my first book came out, I got emails from all kinds of people. William, where did the shot come from? Where did the headshot come from? Where did this happen? What do you think? None of that stuff interests me, and it won't answer anything. It's just batting stuff back and forth. A lot of people uh, look at this as like an interesting game. I've been on the knoll where I saw two businessmen smoking very fine big cigars and pontificating to each other, standing near the pedestal that Abraham Zapruder was on. And I thought, Jesus, I look at this from the standpoint of John F. Kennedy was a human being. His assassination took him away from his children and his wife, changed the course of our history, affected so many people's lives. You can argue that because of his death, we had Vietnam, over 58,000 people died there. So it's not a parlor game to me. It's something that meant something. It still means something to me, obviously, because I'm here talking to you. We've discussed earlier off camera that I don't really go to conventions anymore. I feel like I'm, preaching to the choir. And if I can learn something about the assassination, I will go there. I used to, years ago, I'd hop on a plane at a moment's notice and fly across the country and take away time from my children and wife. But they're all grown now. I've been doing it a long time. I'm older now and have a lot of physical things going on, so I'm a little more reticent to hop on a plane and go places. I'm still doing research, but I don't travel much anymore. So pass this stuff on so that you and others like you can continue. Um, it's been a big part of my life, almost too big. There are things that I wish I didn't know. Okay, sometimes I wish I didn't know that I think our government was involved. All that stuff I read in Best Evidence that I thought was so implausible. It was more plausible than implausible now. I've learned that from these people that I interviewed. You're right. It's pretty scary. And the reason that people don't like to hear about it is it scares the absolute hell out of them. They don't want to believe that their government took out the president of the United States. Well, I'm sorry. It appears that that's true, that there was conspiracy in Kennedy's murder. It wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. I don't hold Lee Harvey Oswald up as some hero. I don't know how deep he was involved, whether he was a patsy or not, like he said. Don't know. I wasn't there. But I can tell you this. He may have shot President Kennedy from that building, although I have great doubts. But Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't responsible for placing John Kennedy's body in a cheap metal shipping casket inside of a body bag. That didn't happen from Lee Harvey Oswald, but it did happen from people that had the power to do that.
That's what scares me when I mention a fraudulent autopsy is like, what, they just didn't perform the proper methods. It's like, well, it goes a little bit deeper than that. I mean, if you think that the government cut out his brain, and nobody knows where that brain is, as far as I know, I think the one piece that we do remember the last track of was Berkeley having the skull fragment. That's to the Kennedy family. That's in the archives of where they said the last remarks of that were.
They said all of that supposedly uh, went to Angie Novello, and that it was placed in a safe um, in that was later taken and given to Angie Novello after Kennedy's it was in Berkeley safe, I think, and then it was given to, I think, Robert Kennedy's secretary in there at State, and then it was placed in a coffin and dumped. I don't know that any of that happened. I can tell you that in talking to the FBI agents, Sibert and O'Neill, that they both told me, and I interviewed them separately. They both used this phrase, and they said, the single bullet theory did not happen. Jim Sibert said, that bullet wound, he said, I stood 2 feet from that wound in the back. He said, that bullet wound was too low in the back to come up and go out his throat. He later told me in a conversation, he said, when you're performing an autopsy without a body, because the doctors changed their mind after the body had gone and they wrote the report, or the report was written, he said, when you're performing an autopsy without a body, he said, you're out of the realm of medical. And he said, you're not doing an autopsy. You're out of the realm of medical and into magic. And then he laughed. So even these FBI guys, these trained FBI guys, told me separately that they did not believe the single bullet theory happened.
Well, who somebody pressured Perry into changing his statement. When you mentioned before about when they gave the official statement or to the news and they said there was a bullet, what I always remember is in Oliver's film when he says there was a bullet to the head and the guy points right to his head.
That was Malcolm Kilduff, who was a second stringer that went along, and he said it was a simple matter, Tom, of a bullet right through the head, and he points to his temple. So you got a little bit of the truth there in the beginning. It was after that cover-ups started to happen. How much time do we have?
Like I said, I gave you 2.5 hours, man. We got another hour if you want.
Okay. Let's talk about the FBI guys for a moment.
Okay.
Sibert and O'Neill was sent by J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, to stay with Kennedy's body and take whatever evidence they could find and take it back to the laboratory in Washington. Now, they're in the motorcade, I believe in the third car, goes to Bethesda. The hearse pulls up out by the side there, and stays some 12 minutes. When I talked to Jim Sibert, I really wanted to talk to Jim Sibert, and the first time I talked to him, I'd been working on the book for quite a while, and I thought I really need to see if I can find this guy and talk to him. Now, I had a stack of papers that had been sent to me by Lancer Communications, headed by Deborah Conway, that I had all these papers where these people would write these FBI agents and say, please give me an interview. I'm writing a paper. Please give me an interview, blah, blah, blah. And they would give their reason for wanting this. And they would always refer them back to the FBI Bureau. And I knew David Lifton had tried to get a hold of them, and they wouldn't ever talk to him, although I believe that Lifton talked to Sibert once briefly. Now, I knew this, so when I looked him up, I just thought I'd see if I could interest him in talking to me and if I could get him to answer a few questions. And I did locate him. And he was in Florida. And now this is back in the days when you could just, look it up on your computer without having to go through a bunch of stuff. And there he was. Actually, I didn't find him. My editor at the time that was working on this book, editing for me, was Alan Eaglesham, and he located him. And I called him. And he, I'm trying to remember, I guess it was Sibert first. It's been so long now, I have trouble remembering who I talked to first. I guess it was Sibert. And I called him up and I said, who I was, and that I was working on this book, and would he talk to me about that? And he said, I've dropped some of the first bombs over Europe. I don't have any stars in my eyes. I don't need to be quoted in books. But he said he would answer some questions for me. And one of the first things that I asked him was about the notes that he had written. Uh, they wrote like 5.5 pages of notes when they were in the autopsy room. And in this 5.5 pages of notes, they wrote there has been a tracheotomy performed as well as surgery of the head area, namely in the top of the skull. Now, this is what led David Lifton, after seeing this, to pursue it and write Best Evidence. So I wanted to ask Sibert about that. And he said to me, well, I wish we would have worded it better. It would have saved some confusion in some books. And he went on to answer some questions for me. And I said, you know, I would like to come interview you. And he said, for my book. And he said, well, I don't want to be interviewed. I don't want to sit before the camera. And but he could sense again the disappointment in my voice. And he said, but I'll tell you what. He said, the next time you call me, if you have a list of questions, I'll do my best to answer them. So now I'm elated because I still have my foot in the door. So I asked him did he have a phone number for Frank O'Neill, who was his partner? And he had it in his Rolodex, and he gave it to me. And so I called the number, and I think he was in Massachusetts. And I called him, and the voice that answered the phone said, Frank O'Neill. And I said, I'd like to talk to Mr. O'Neill, please. And he said, well, this is Frank O'Neill. He said, you want senior or do you want junior? And I said, well, I want the guy that was at Kennedy's autopsy. And he said, well, that's me. Voice was very clipped, very short, very commanding. It was so I went to my little spiel and said, I just talked to your partner and I'm doing this book, and I'd like you to be part of it. And he said, well, I don't know. He said, I'm going to call Jim first, and I'm going to talk to Jim. And he said, as for an interview, I'll have to think about it. So he went on to say, I said, well, could I just, he says he wasn't going to answer any questions. I said, could I just ask you one question? He said, well, I've already said I'm not interested in an interview. He didn't want to do an interview with me. He said, I've already told you I didn't want to do an interview, but go ahead. So he let me ask a question. So I said, did President Kennedy's body look like what you remembered from the autopsy pictures? Very clipped. And he said, some of them did, some of them didn't. And I pushed it. And I said, did President Kennedy's body look like what you remember? He said, no. Well, I'd asked my question. So that was it. So I didn't have hardly anything. I think I had the report from the Records Review Board. Maybe I didn't at that point, but I gathered all the information I could. I read all that I could so that I have this stuff in my head. Now, I really felt that I had connected with Jim Sibert. He was affable. He was nice to me. I felt like I really had a breakthrough with this guy, and so I waited a week or two, and I called him back and I introduced myself, and he said, "Yeah." Now he'd been kind and told me things and answered my questions, and now the voice comes back, "Yeah."
Mhm.
And I said, remember, Mr. Sibert, you said that if I called back, you would answer a list of questions. He said, listen, he said, everything I have to say is in the FD 302 report that Frank and I did. He said, I know that you're interested in these things, but he said, you'll just have to wait until all these records are released, and then you'll understand. So
That's not good enough. That's not good enough, Will. I would have pressed him. I would have went to his house. I would have bothered him.
Well, wait, there's more coming. So he I think this is the point where I started asking him about I said, can I just ask a couple of questions? And he said, I said, President Kennedy's body in the autopsy pictures. I said, I said, did that look like what you remember? He said, well, he said, the president's head, he said, there wasn't anything that clean. He said, it wasn't all together like that. It wasn't as clean like that as in those pictures. And he said, maybe that those pictures were taken after the morticians got done with their work. And I'm like an idiot. I blurted out, no, sir. As far as we know, all the pictures were taken at the beginning of the autopsy, which really ticked him off. And he said, and that's when he said, uh, you know, I'll probably be 90 years old still answering these questions. You'll just have to wait until it's all released and you'll understand. So that was it. So obviously what had happened was I called O'Neill, and O'Neill called Jim Sibert and talked Jim Sibert into not talking to me. So I decided to go ahead and try to contact O'Neill, and I did. And he was very brusque, and I that I put that in the first part where I talked to him, but that's it was the second call where I got to ask the question and said, "Well, could I just ask one question?" He says, "I've decided not to do the interview," and that's when I said, "Would you mind if I just asked a couple of questions?" He says, "Well, I've already told you I don't want to do the interview, but go ahead." So then I asked the question about about the body and did he remember the body looking like that, and he hung up. Now I'm talking to air. 3 years go by. I'm still working on the book because I had to do this. I had to fly out when I had time and money, and my kids were little back then, so I could do it. I had to do it while time permitted. So it took me about 6 years to get this whole thing together. And when I thought the book was basically ready for publication, just so that I could tell the reader that I'd given it my best shot, I decided to try to contact the FBI agents again. So now keep in mind, it's 3 years later. I called O'Neill first this time, and I was expecting this person to be gruff and clipped. And I introduced myself, told him my name, told him what I was doing. He apparently didn't remember me. He said, "Oh yeah," he said, "I was involved in Kennedy's autopsy." He sounded a little glad to hear from me. Gone was the agent that was brusque and clipped. He appeared to be glad to hear from me.
He probably found weed. He found weed. That's what happened.
So, well, maybe. But he started telling me about his time in World War II, about how he was a paratrooper, going through his exploits, all this stuff. And then he let me ask some questions about the Kennedy assassination. So, and I asked him the same thing. Did the president's body look like what you remembered in the pictures? And he said, well, he said, yeah, for the most part. He said maybe some of them looked a little different, but there wasn't any great thing. And then I was really disappointed because he had told me no before, that body wasn't what he remembered. So we ended on a good note, and he said, "Don't you think the Kennedys, if there was a conspiracy to kill the president, would have spent the very last dime they had to get to the bottom of it?" So I came up with the thing of I'm gonna use this manuscript I have to keep calling them, keep asking questions, and I did that. And Jerrol Custer, at one point during his interview, said that the FBI agent Sibert and O'Neill was at his hip all the time. They were with him all the time. When I told this to O'Neill, he said, "Nah, that man's sick. That wasn't us." So I would find little reasons to call back, and so over a period of weeks and months, he would remember me, and I would call him and I would ask questions, and it got him comfortable. It got him to where at one point he mentioned some document, and I happened to have a document, and I sent him the document, and that kind of opened up the floodgate to where I was able to ask questions. And when I pulled everything out of him that I could, I didn't call Sibert. I just took my time with O'Neill, and he just I kept saying, "Would you let me come out and see you?" "Well, no, I won't do that." So he let me. At the end, I was just able to ask questions, and he would say, "No, it didn't happen," Kennedy wasn't killed of a conspiracy, but then he would tell me things that would lead me in the opposite direction. At one point, he said that this was not too long after 9/11, and he said, I'm going to go to Europe, and I said, well, surely you're not gonna go at this point. And he said, well, he said, I still have friends that are in the bureau, and they tell me what's really going on, not what they want you to think is going on, which told me a lot. So after I got done with O'Neill, I decided to call Sibert. Same thing. I introduced myself, told him who I was, have this manuscript. I'm going to go to publication. I'd like to get your opinion on some things. Nice, friendly agent lets me ask questions. So I'm asking him these questions. I got to talk about the brain. He says, well, you could look right into the cranium and you could just look right down into it. And at one point I said, well, I've talked to your partner, Frank O'Neill. He said there wasn't any brain in the head. And he laughed. So it's in the little details that you can get your questions answered. And then I went back to, how the body looked, and he said, "Well, it wasn't as clean." There was, so I imagine I sent him the autopsy photographs, which he looked at and critiqued for me. Okay, so he told me all these things, and I thought everybody that's ever wanted anything out of these two agents, they always want something, but they never give anything to these guys. So I came upon a little plan, along with trying to get Sibert to answer my question about how the body was and what he looked at and that sort of thing. I thought, well, I'll send him some books because by talking to him, he knew a lot of the literature. He had read David Lifton's Best Evidence. He had read a whole lot of these books. So I decided that I would send him some books, the latest books on the assassination. So I think I sent him Assassination Science and Murder and Dealey Plotting. And I came home from work, and my wife at the time said, William, you got a call from a Jim Sibert? And I thought, oh. So I called him back the next day and says, I wasn't expecting anything like this. Good night. He said, I've finished one of them already. This was just like days after I'd sent him the book. So he was really happy about getting this book. And I'd been talking to him over the phone, I did the same thing I did with O'Neill. I called him, got him comfortable. He would always take my call and I would ask questions. So now I know, I've made a real pain in their ass of myself with these guys. I pushed it with O'Neill as much as I could, and he wouldn't let me come out. But now I have Sibert, and I've got to give it one more shot. And I said, I'm working on this book, and I said, I'd really like to write a profile on you, but it's kind of hard to do if you haven't really met the person. I said, there are a couple of other people down your way that I would like to interview, and if I ever get out that way, would you mind if I interviewed you? And I held my breath. I literally held my breath. And I've got the phone in my hand, and my hand is just clenching the receiver. And I hear him say, no. I thought, well, I've blown that. And he says, no, I wouldn't mind.
Oh my God, you got it. That's like, it's those types of experiences that really fascinate me. I mean, even just the persistence as well too, because I mean, when he mentioned something about saying, I guess I'll probably be 90 when those documents get released. I mean, and then you'll know what I know. For me and any other person that's probably a conspiracy person is going to be, oh my God, it's a government, it's all this, it's like this. That might be true, but man, it scares the hell out of me. Like I mentioned to you, about 30 minutes ago or so, about when it comes to the autopsy, if you find out your government did all that, I don't know if I could handle it, to be 100% honest. And I know a lot of stuff. I mean, I brought up an article to a bunch of these political researchers that were talking about the deep politics and all that. They're friends of mine, Rich Bartholomew and David Denton, who does the JFK conferences and stuff. I just brought up an article I remember seeing on CBS about a truck of heads, just a truck of human heads that had wrecked. And they put an article up about it. And they're like, what? And I was like, wait a minute, you guys study the deep state and all that, but I'm showing you this. And it wasn't to make fun of them. It was just, this is something that's real. And you don't really question stuff like this. And you start realizing is like, how dark does this go? And I understand of trying to keep a narrative. I mean, trust me, I think everybody's life would be a little bit easier if it was just a lone nutter, if it was this, but it's not. There's plenty of evidence to show that it was way more than that. And that's the part where I can understand lone nutters saying there isn't a conspiracy because maybe they're trying to keep their Santa Claus is real scenario going. And I go, I get it, but I want to know the truth. And I know I might not like what that truth is, and it might be scary, but you also have to recognize evil when you're around evil. If we just completely sit with our heads in the sand, it's not going to really go well for anybody.
That's very well put. Um, where were we? Well, I ended with talking to Sibert. Oh yeah, he said no, I wouldn't mind. So I immediately booked a plane, got the ticket, called him back, said, I can be here and here, and he said that'll be fine. Didn't question the fact that I had just moved right in and went for it. And then I had been working closely with JFK Lancer at that point, and was quite close to Deborah Conway, who ran that organization. And so I called her up and told her I had this interview with Sibert. She says, "I wish I could go there." I said, I said, she said, "I could be the document lady. I could bring you the documents and help you with this." And I said, "Well, all right, be the document lady. I'll call him back and see if I can have you come." And so at that point, he made the commitment. So he's like, "Yeah, go ahead, bring her." So um, I got it together. Deborah came, I came. We met in Florida at the airport. The next morning at our hotel, Sibert had agreed to pick us up. And now I didn't say I'm gonna film this. I didn't want to scare him, and I didn't want to bring a lot of camera equipment because nobody had ever done it before. No researcher, no private researcher had really ever sat with Sibert. I mean, outside of a government body, I'm it. I broke through. So I didn't want to scare him. So I took a little bitty camcorder and I had it in a blue bag along with some tapes and a pocket recorder. And we're having coffee. And I said to Deborah, I said, "Now listen," I said, "I've come up with this plan." I said, "After we get into his home," I said, I'm gonna, I said, "I want you to, I'm gonna say, Mr. Sibert, would you mind if I camcord this?" And if he says no, then I want you to take this. I reached into the bag. I said, "I want you to take this little recorder, and I want you to say, 'William, I have this, if this will help you.'" I said, "If he says no to that," he says, "What I want you," I said, "What I want you to do is I want you to sit in a corner with a pad and a pencil, and I want you to write just as fast as you can everything that we're saying." Okay. So I have this whole scenario built in my head about how this is going to go because I know I have to capture this. Right. So he comes in and he's wearing a pullover shirt, a pair of jeans, and a pair of old moccasins, and he's straight back. Now at this point, he's in his early 80s. He's got chiseled features, snow white hair, combed back, very distinguished looking. And we introduce ourselves, and he takes us out to his car, and he's got his wife Esther with him. Now, the one thing I really wanted to do is I wanted to clear up this thing about Kennedy's brain, right? I wanted confirmation whether there was a brain or there wasn't a brain, and I had wrecked my brain, and I couldn't figure out how to ask this question tactfully. Okay, so we're sitting in this car. Deborah's on in the back seat over here, and I'm sitting behind Sibert, and I'm staring at the back of his head, and I'm thinking, how the hell am I going to bring up this question to this guy? He's going to take us to our rental car. Okay, so we're sitting there, and he's driving along, and I said, Mr. Sibert, I'm so glad that I could be here with you because you actually saw President Kennedy's body, and you can tell me so many things. And his little wife, Esther, turns around from the front seat and she says, I'll never forget it. She says, well, his brains were all blown out of his head. Well, what happened, of course, is that Jim went home that night after Kennedy's autopsy, and he says to his wife, S, he called her S, not Esther. He always called her S. He said, S, guess what I saw? And Kennedy didn't have any brains in his head. So once again, I'm trying to be cool, and I say, well, that was one of the questions I was going to ask. So we had some trouble getting to our rental car. We couldn't find it. Now Sibert is on. Now Sibert, the FBI agent, is here, and he's like, this is a mission, and we're going to find this place and get this car. So we spent some time doing that. But then we follow him to his home, and we get into his apartment. They live in a very fine, posh residence for older people. It has its own bar and restaurant and gym and hospital across the way, all very nice. And we get up to his place. We get into his office, and he sits in his chair at his desk, and he puts his arms back like this, and he goes, okay, who wants to write? And so I start into my spiel, and I say, now I'm looking around his office at the same time, and he's got a whole shelf of assassination literature. So I know that he's into this. He knows stuff. And I'm looking around, and he's got medals on his walls from World War II. And just, I couldn't believe that I'm actually sitting here in Jim Sibert's office, So he says, who wants to write? And I say, Mr. Sibert, would you mind if I camcord this? He says, no, go ahead. So gone are all my little scenario, and Deborah doesn't have to, bring out the recorder or any of that. Just go ahead and do it. So I set the camera up, and we start asking questions. We spent, I believe, about 12 hours with Mr. Sibert that day. He took us to dinner. We took a break. He took us downstairs, took us to dinner. And, people are going by. People lived in this thing where, like, there were famous people that had flown planes in World War II. There was an original guy from the OSS that was there. He went by the table saying hi. There were people coming up asking who we were. And Mrs. Sibert would say, oh, this gentleman is writing a book about Jim. And I would look over at Jim, and his eyes were just sparkling, and he was very relaxed, and just, I couldn't believe it. It was fantastic. And if you want to read that interview, you can see it or read it in The Eye of History, which is the first book I wrote. It was an amazing experience. And then later I went back and brought them all. I brought the remaining people that were still alive in 2002 with Jim Sibert. I brought them all to Florida, and we sat around a table, and we projected the autopsy pictures up on the wall, and everybody talked about what was wrong with the pictures and what was right with the pictures, and we just had a good go at it. And you can see that in a DVD I did called The Gathering. So it's just been an amazing experience for me. Go ahead. You seem like you want to ask.
I was about to say, we've been talking long enough, William. I could talk to you for hours, man, about this. Unless you had anything else you wanted to add. I hear your dog's barking. I figured I'd let you say your links and everything, and we can end the recording if you want.
Are you bored with me already?
No. Just I hear your dogs bark. I didn't know if somebody was at your door or something, so I wanted to give you a chance to be able to promote your links and say where people can find your books and everything too. You gave me a lot, man. I'm gonna. Do you have any of your books on Audible that I can listen to?
There are no books on Audible. Why don't you give me your mailing address and I'll just send you some copies.
Because I love the everything you told me about the interview process of meeting these guys. That stuff I really find fascinating. Especially the situations like I don't know if you incorporate like the car ride and everything, looking for a rental car and that's great stuff, man. That's stuff I really enjoy and I like. It's like background scenes to a movie, basically. When you find that you watch the director's cut and they show you all the things they don't incorporate in the original
Well,
cut.
I mean, it happened just like that. It happened just like when Esther turned around and she said, "Well, his brains were all blown out of his head." That that was the story. There was no brain in his head when the body was received, in the Bethesda morgue. So we have Paul O'Connor who says there was no brain to be removed, and yet we have Jim Jenkins who said didn't say I saw the brain come out of the skull. He said I was handed a brain that night.
Well, there was the Kennedy family photographer. I forgot what her name was, who said Kennedy never looked this bad before. Like when she was looking at the photos of his autopsy, he never
Oh,
looked
you're
this bad.
talking about Sandra Spencer.
Yeah, and then she talked about how there was a brain apparently in the background or something like that that was on a table.
I was the first one after the Records Review Board to talk to Sandra Spencer. And she told me the story that she had told to the Records Review Board. Sandra Spencer developed negatives at the Anacostia lab 2 or 3 days after Kennedy was assassinated, brought to her by James K. Fox, who was the uh, uh, photographer for the Secret Service. Um, and in these pictures, she said that the body had a more relaxed look on his face. The hair had been washed. There was no blood. The wound to the throat was thumbnail sized. Um, there was a sheet up to his neck. Didn't see any. I think she told me that she didn't see any incision, so she didn't see the Y incision. But she said these were a set of photographs that were taken. I'm sorry about the dogs.
You're good.
The that were taken in case the family had to see something. And at one point, she said, I don't think that it was there was a brain on the table next to Kennedy's ear. And I said, was the brain whole? And she said, yeah. She said, I don't think it was President Kennedy's brain because the wound to the head wasn't big enough to take the brain out. She was not she was not she didn't have any guile in her. It was not like she was making up a story. She was puzzled while she was telling me this. It was like, I can't explain the thumbnail size to the throat. I don't grasp why about the hair, but she said that's what those negatives showed. She said the person that brought them to her said, you don't look at them, just develop them. And she says, well, I have to look at them for the color balance. And he says, well, okay. He says, look at them, but don't peruse them. So she was able to do it that way. And she said, but there was no grimace on his face. It was a more relaxed set. The brain by the ear blew me away. So where does that little scenario come in at? I absolutely believed her when she told me that. I absolutely believe her. And in my book, In the Eye of History, I sent her an overblown uh, set of autopsy pictures in a silver ink pen to mark on these what she saw. Let me see if I don't know if it'll show up, but in the in the very back of this thing, let me see. I have this set now. Sandra Spencer has since passed. Now this is a good example. Okay, in this picture right here, you can see where she has taken her ink pen and marked the differences from this picture from what she saw in the negatives. As far as I know, I'm the only person to ever do that. So yeah, that was an experience all in of itself. I mean, I've had these experiences, and that was what for me what this was all about. It wasn't about writing. I'm glad I wrote a book, and I'm glad some people get something out of it. But it really wasn't about that. I burned so hot for this knowledge. I had to know what happened to President Kennedy so badly. It had gotten to me so much that I had to know. I mean, because I'm not generally a person that would be bold and go out there and start pushing, you know? But I had to know so much. I had to know so badly that I couldn't stop myself. And I just found myself doing that. I recently, within the last couple of years, and I haven't written about it yet, so I don't want to get too far into it. But I was in a position where I was going to be able to see something that people don't get to see. Okay, haven't been seen.
I had a buddy who's done my show in the past a couple of times. He's a good friend I met through the show, and we talk on the phone. And he told me, he was like, if I ever see, like, you die under mysterious circumstances, I know why, because all the episodes you're having on your podcast are like, they're very deep. And I'm like, well, I mean, dude, I want people to see what I have now seen. I had someone comment on one of my videos saying I'm persistent. And I'm like, I need to talk to any person who's researched this or looked into this, because you need that. I mean, if anything, it's logged for people to be able to listen to and hopefully spark up interest and see why I'm passionate about, researching it myself as well too. And it's why I like the conversation style rather than like a strict interview. It pulls people out of that like question based thing and lets it kind of, just let talk. I feel like people enjoy that a little bit better. I don't know, maybe that's just me.
Well, that's the kind of interview that I like doing. It's kind of a table talk. I like kind of a table talk. We can go where you want to go in the conversation. We can talk about areas that you want to talk about. You can ask me questions. I've done this a lot over the years, and so my story is out there. But so I try to tell different aspects of it when I can, um, so that people can get the whole picture. But really, the story is in the eye of history. And I did write a little book for Hugh Clark, who was one of the men who took President Kennedy's body to Arlington National Cemetery. You've probably seen that old footage where they're going down the street and the body's on the platform and they're going and the drums are beating. Well, one of those men I became friends with, and I wrote a book for him. He has since passed away, but it's on the record now. Didn't get to tell you this, but in 2015, I, with another researcher, did a film shoot in Chicago where we brought three of the men from the autopsy that were still alive, and three of the men who actually were the honor guard, the official honor guard, and we put them together. And they hadn't heard each other's stories before. And it was quite shocking to the honor guard to hear what the people from the morgue had to say. And it opened up a whole conversation. It's all been put on film. I don't know if it'll ever be released, but that was absolutely fascinating. We had some breakthroughs in that. Hopefully it'll get seen one day. Um, I've had all kinds of experiences like that, and that has made the whole trip worth it. It's not the arguing with people on forums. It's not getting into fights with other researchers who don't agree with me. I know what I know. I've been through what I've been through. I've experienced what I've experienced. And so that's the only thing I can tell you. I don't claim to be an expert on anything. I know what I know. Here's what I experienced. I put it in a book so that you could read about it. But it wasn't even, people go, I did this for the research community. I did this so you could have it. I did everything that I did for me. The mere fact that I put it in book form so that other people could read about it, that's great. And if you get something from it, terrific. That's always a bonus for me. But it was real. David Lifton said to me one time when we were talking, there was a little point in our lives when we tried to work together for a while. And he told me, he said, you're awful self-indulgent, William. And I guess sometimes in matters like this, I am a little self-indulgent. I will go wherever I have to go. If I really burn with it, I am like you. I have to take it through. I don't have a choice. And I was the experience I started to tell you about. I won't tell you where it was or what it was about, but I was really pushing on this, and I said, I need to go see. Can we go down? Can we see that? Can you take me there right now? Can we? And Jim Jenkins was with me. And he said, William, wait a minute. No, no, we need to see this. Can you show this to me? Can you take me there right now? Because I knew I had one shot at this. I'll when the work's completed, I'll tell you what it was all about. But it was like I was like, I got one shot at this, and you need to take me there. I'm here. I came all this way here. Show it to me. And I was joking with Jim after that, and I said, I always thought I was pretty nice about things. He says, well, yeah, you're pretty good, but he says even then it's sometimes pretty damn crass. I don't want to be that way, but sometimes you have to grab the moment when the moment is there, and sometimes you don't get anywhere by being timid. Most of the time, I try to be easy and be nice and just come in under the radar. And sometimes I don't have time for that. And sometimes I just have to go where I have to go. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But it's taken me places I never thought I would go. I've had the opportunity to meet people that I never thought I would meet. I mean, I've gone on to do stuff on the RFK assassination that's just been unbelievable.
I'll be reaching out to you on that next once I get onto RFK.
I've had many conversations with what's left of Sirhan's family. Sirhan, his brother would call me and say, Sirhan says, what is William Law up to? What is William Law doing? That freaked me out a little bit, to know that Sirhan was asking about me. Just things like that, and hopefully someday. I've been working on that book for a long time. Hopefully I'll get it done.
But Will, where can people find your links, man? Your books, any other things you want to promote, your Twitter if you have one?
I don't have I'm not really too much online as far as that. I do have Facebook. You can ask me questions through that. You can get my books through Trine Day publication. You can get my books through Amazon or any bookstore will carry them. That's about it. I guess I'll promote this and hold this up. This is the book that I worked for 6 years to research and write. And then I have Betrayal that I wrote for Hugh Clark, the person that took President Kennedy's body to Arlington National Cemetery, and I have At the Cold Shoulder of History that I wrote with Jim Jenkins, that you can also get at the same places.
Well, I'm going to link it all in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.